Hi, this is a PowerPoint video about local and state government spending. Once the government has our tax dollars, what does it do with them? And the short answer is that it depends. Remember, the United States has three levels of government: local, state, and federal, also known as the national or central government in Washington, D.C. Each level of government spends differently because each level has different responsibilities. First, let's look at local and town governments. So, this is local government revenue, in other words, where the tax dollars come from. Roughly 48% comes from intergovernmental transfers. That's money that comes from the feds and state governments to these towns. For example, the state government gives a lot of money to poor towns like Boston, Lowell, Lawrence, Fall River for their public schools. So, this is money that's going from the federal government, from the state government to local town governments. About a quarter or 25% comes from charges and miscellaneous receipts, and about a third of the money comes from the property tax. This is where cities and towns get their money, again, from the federal government and state governments, from charges and miscellaneous receipts, and from the property tax. For example, let's look at the town of Needham and see where their tax revenue comes from. The town of Needham gets about $100 million a year from property taxes on people's homes. It gets about $10 million from the state, and that money goes to the public schools. And it gets about $7 million coming in from local receipts. In other words, it borrows money through bonds, sells restaurants liquor licenses, sells people dog licenses, and all this brings in money for the local town government. Parking permits brings in money. A car excise tax, it's a sales tax on cars. Fines, okay, if you pull a fire alarm, you get fined. That brings in money. And so does pilot. What does pilot stand for? It stands for payment in lieu of, in place of taxes. So, colleges and universities and hospitals usually do not pay local taxes. Instead, they negotiate a pilot with the town. For example, Olin College will not pay local taxes to Needham, they will negotiate a pilot payment. Or Harvard and MIT will not pay taxes to the city of Cambridge. Instead, they'll negotiate a pilot, a payment in lieu of, in place of taxes. And about $3 million comes into the town from other sources. So all told, 110 and 7 and 3, the town brings in about $120 million. That's the total cost to run Needham for 1 year. Now, where does the town of Needham spend its money? About $50 million is spent on schools. And I want you guys to think about, what do you think the largest school cost is? When we spend $50 million on our local public schools, where's that money really going? About $35 million is paid to pay off debt and also for town employee benefits, like people working in the town hall, or for teachers, cops, firefighters, benefits. $25 million is spent on general expenses, about $5 million for the town police, $7 million for the town fire department, $5 million on the Department of Public Works. That's for snow removal and to repair roads and potholes. And we spend money on water and sewer. The restaurants need to be monitored and inspected. Public transportation, especially for poor old people. We also spend money on running local elections and keeping records of who bought which house and who was born in town and who died and who owns this house and that kind of thing. About $8 million are spent on public facilities. So that's maintaining public buildings like the town hall, an airport if there's one in town, and the hospital. About $1 million is spent on the library, and $500,000 or half a million is spent on parks and recs. That's mowing DeFazio Field, and if the town has beaches, and the town pool. So again, if you add this up, you see it costs about $120 million total to run Needham for 1 year. So, what do town governments in the United States spend tax dollars on? And are you okay with how our tax dollars are spent by the local town government? Next, do local or town governments have to balance their budgets? First of all, what is a budget? It's a yearly plan of taxing and spending. It's a financial plan. If your taxes bring in more than the spending, then you end up with more money. We call that a surplus. You end up plus with more money. If your taxes bring in less than your spending, then you have a deficit. You're spending more than you bring in. And if your taxes bring in the same amount of money that you spend, then you have what we call a balanced budget. Do local governments balance their budgets? Yes, most local town governments balance their budgets. Some are required to do so by the state, some are required to do so by their town or city charter, and some aren't required to do so at all. So it's hard to generalize. There are thousands and thousands of towns and cities in the United States, but for the most part, most local town governments balance their budgets. Let's now look at state governments. Where do state governments get their money? Well, again, about 40% comes from intergovernmental transfers. That's money that comes mostly from the federal government, and it comes from Medicaid. That's state health care for poor people. About 20% comes from charges and miscellaneous. Another 20% comes basically from your sales tax. 15% comes from your state individual income tax. And most states also have a corporate income tax. Now, easy question here. How many states are there? And are they all funded the same way? No, of course not. So let's look at the next slide. This slide is a little hard to read, but you can quickly figure it out. Let's look at the composition of state revenue. Where do the state governments get their money from? The brown is basically sales taxes. The light beige here, the yellow, is property taxes. And the green are individual income and corporate income taxes. So what you see here are the 50 states. Do all 50 states get their money in the same way? Or do they vary and get their money from different places and different amounts? Let's look at Massachusetts. Massachusetts state budget for 2019. It costs about $40 billion to run this state for 1 year. Where does that $40 billion go? Well, if you look here, you see 54%, or about half, call it 50%, that is spent on health and human services. And that's basically Medicaid. Again, that's health care for the poor. In Massachusetts, the program is called Mass Health. The purple, what's the purple? It's education. About 20% of the money is spent on education. That's money that goes to poor towns like Boston, Lowell, Lawrence, Fall River. Okay? It goes to public universities like UMass, Framingham State, Bridgewater State, and community colleges like Mass Bay and Massasoit. So that's your education. The dark blue, those are your sheriffs, your district attorneys, and your state tax collector. The highways are about 5%. So again, what in general do state governments do? What do they spend money on? And are you okay with how your tax dollars are spent by the state? Just for a frame of reference, Massachusetts costs about $40 to run for a year. California is the largest state. It costs $200 billion to run California for a year. Vermont is one of the smallest states. It costs $6 billion to run Vermont for a year. States and towns fund more than 90% of public school money. The federal government in Washington, D.C. pays less than 10% of public school money. Which states have good public schools? This is a magazine called Education Week, and they give report cards. They give grades. The blue here is B's and A's. Which states have good public schools? Which region has good public schools? But good public schools cost money. How much does Massachusetts spend on each student? You can see the color here, and you can see the Kier legend here. So which regions have the best schools, which get B's and A's on their public schools? And which regions spend the most on each student? Why do schools cost so much money? Well, let's look at this. What is this graph? What is this map showing you? And in this region, what are they spending a lot on? So if you look here, this is our state and local tax burden. That's state and local taxes combined. How heavy a burden is it on us? Well, for example, you look at New York, okay, they've got the number one largest state and local tax burden, lots of state and local taxes. Where does that money go? Well, look here. Where does that money go? Okay, and what are they spending on? They're spending on their students. And how are their schools? You can see how their schools rate. Now, do state governments balance their budget? Well, sort of, kinda. It depends on what you mean. Every state except for Vermont must balance its budget. So if it spends $10, it's got to bring in $10. If it brings in $20, it can only spend $20. And that requirement is imposed on the state by the state's constitution or a state law or a judge. However, the devil is in the details. To make a long story short, a lot of states only balance their operating budgets. That includes what it takes to operate the state on a day-to-day basis. For example, payroll, okay, salaries. But when you come to capital expenses, like long-term projects to build a highway or to build a building or a new airport, then it's okay for the state government to borrow and go into debt. I'll say it again. In most states, they balance their operating budget. So if they bring in $10, they can only spend $10 on the salaries of their state employees and their state cops, state prisons. But if they want to do some construction, like build a highway or a new prison or an airport, if they want to do these capital expenses, then it's okay for them to go into debt. Let's look and see here which states have the most debt per person. You have to look at it per person. How else can you compare California, which has a ton of people, with Montana, which has very few people? So let's look at the state debt load per capita, per person. Which state has the most debt per person? Which state has the most debt per person? Okay, this is 2011. Here it is, 2012. Here are your states, and you can see, where does Massachusetts rank? One of the highest state debt loads compared to the state's economy? One of the highest state debt loads or one of the lightest? Next, we'll look at the federal government. What does it do with our tax dollars? I hope this was clear. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.